Our next speaker is Ms. Sheila Newman, who started the Victorian branch of Sustainable Population Australia in 1992 and held the first Victorian Conference on Population in 1994 at the Melbourne Zoo. An evolutionary sociologist and author, Sheila's 2002 thesis on political systems of population, environment, energy and housing identified why Australia's population was growing rapidly and why that of France was not. Her most recent book, Demography, Territory and Law, The Rules of Animal and Human Populations, launches a completely new evolutionary theory and peer-reviewed theory, combining innovative and useful hypotheses about human and animal societies' distinct patterns of dispersal affecting population sizes and in humans affecting the very nature of economic and political systems. Sheila is the editor, writer and cartoonist of the unique interactive website candobetter.net. One thing I must mention that I actually haven't mentioned to the speakers is that we'll get a warning of a little bell when there's a minute to go in the talk. Welcome, Sheila.
Good afternoon. The question is, does Melbourne have to keep growing? My response is that it is not a natural inbuilt requirement that populations constantly increase in size. Many developed and undeveloped countries and regions are not growing like Australia. Pacific Islanders had stable populations for about 60,000 years. Although most industrialised countries ballooned with access to cheap fossil fuel, many reset their population growth downwards after the game-changing 1973 oil shock. But countries that inherited the British land tenure and political system, the UK, the United States, Australia and Canada, did not reset. They borrowed to continue population growth and expansion. Secondly, there is no economic imperative to keep population growing, as is being done via high immigration. Plenty of countries survive well with small, stable populations. So why is Melbourne's population projected to skyrocket? Unfortunately, the problem is that population increase is being engineered by sociological forces that are responding to focused benefits from the very things that cause suffering to the rest of us and damage the natural world. By this I mean that via high immigration policies, powerful people in various business groups are successfully enacting pro-growth ideologies. All that the counter-growth movement is really asking for is that the growth lobby desist and allow our population to evolve naturally and democratically. We are not the population controllers, they are. These pro-growth forces are highly organised, very determined and very wealthy. They own and control most of the assets and resources, including the mass media and, arguably, large parts of Australia's parliament. The rest of us are relatively disorganised and poor because of this political system which concentrates land, resources and power in fewer and fewer hands. Some traditional avenues of resistance exist, although all are compromised in this system. One new one is present, that is the internet. The traditional options are power in public institutions and utilities, power of employment connections, power of family and clan communication, and power of local government. Power in public institutions and utilities. Historically, even though our system placed much power in private hands, in the 19th and 20th centuries we built up public institutions that safeguarded citizens' rights to affordable water and food, electricity, housing, education, reliable employment, regulated banking. Most of these public institutions that protected our rights have since been privatised and taken beyond our influence. Power of employment connections. Unions once brought together workers with common cause to preserve financial and other easily identifiable benefits, but the support of industrial relations and law institutions have largely been dismantled, and Australian workforces are now dispersed and temporary. Power of family communication and clans. One of the problems of population growth and infrastructure expansion is that it means that planners constantly insert new people and groups in buildings and roads and activities among us, interfering with established human networks. Family communication is also an uphill battle with TV, Facebook, school, commuting to work, and if you are one of many isolated Australians going from one rental to the next, couch surfing or sleeping rough. Ironically, wealthy families and clans that stick together, like the Dennis Family Corporation, the Murdochs, the Packers and the Windsors, rule the world. As more Australians become unemployed and cannot afford housing, the upside is that they will default back to family, clan and locality and communicate with neighbours on issues of mutual convenience and grow food and trade at the same level. Direct power at local level, accessed by well-networked families and clans together with neighbours, is probably the most effective way to counteract the growth lobby on the ground and decisions by unrepresentative distant central governments. Women seem to lead most of the coordinated actions against overdevelopment and overpopulation in Melbourne, heading democratic planning groups, public land defence groups, ecological and wildlife protection groups, contributing to alternative media, attending Parliament and organising demonstrations. They are our great strength. Their political engagement is underreported in the mainstream media, as you would expect. Power of local government. Most people believe that immigration is entirely managed by the federal government, but it is at the level of local government that population control actually starts. Local government traditionally controls building permits to control population numbers by limiting subdivisions and land clearing. This mechanism gave Australians direct control over the size of their communities. State governments in Australia have been removing this very important local government power over decades, with local government amalgamations, administrative control and laws reducing local power. Local power is the most direct and potentially useful form of democracy, more likely to unite people with a stake in the same bit of the real world. State government. In Australia, the states have the power over land use and water sources and the ability and responsibility to signal when infrastructure is close to capacity. They have largely taken over immigration policy decisions from the federal government by calling themselves regions in need of migration and setting up websites and industries to market housing, business investment and citizenship to prospective economic immigrants all over the world. All the states do this, but in Victoria the website is www.liveinvictoria.gov.au. Obviously this website needs to come down. The national government makes decisions to support wars and sets policies for humanitarian and economic immigration. The public messaging system has erroneously convinced many people that most immigrants are refugees, using the issue as a wedge tactic to prevent people speaking out on numbers. At the same time, the media fails to critically examine the fact that many of our refugees and asylum seekers come from the very places where we are engaged with NATO in what are arguably illegal resource wars. The Australian public is given no say in whether we support such wars. The pro-growth forces control the mass media, that is, the public messaging system, which seems largely to control election choices and politicians' policies. The effect is that, although the majority of populations do not want population growth or its impacts, their opinion is not clearly reported and they are not aware of each other. Most of the Australian media and much overseas media are owned by Packer, Fairfax and particularly the Murdoch corporations, which have vested interest in massive population growth, most obviously in their property.coms, realestate.com.au and domain.com.au, which sell Australian land and housing all over the world in a market that is enhanced by the promise of continuous population growth. CNN, the BBC, Al Jazeera, the ABC and SBS and generally all mainstream Anglophone press share biases and syndicate reports. The internet. So, how do we overcome a commercially compromised and unresponsive public messaging system that repetitively pervades this propaganda, making us believe it is both irresistible and true? By going around it and creating media that is far more relevant to most people on the principle that real news is of real interest and that people, although schooled to passively absorb anointed opinion, if they wake up, don't want to go to sleep again. The traditional media relies a lot on distant authorities and events which we cannot verify or affect. The alternative media can convey news from people on the ground almost anywhere in the world. The traditional media creates stars and elevates as authorities, people who continually tell us that we must have growth. It is hard to get the attention of family, neighbours, colleagues and friends to our divergent point of view because they are conditioned to give more respect to mass media stars and opinions than to direct communication and experience. The alternative media, such as ourcandobetter.net, can identify our own real heroes and authorities. We can use the internet to do this, as many grassroots organisations in BRICS countries now do. The traditional media syndicates news and feature articles. We should do the same by republishing each other's work on our various websites, by reciprocal interviewing and by inviting each other to speak at events, thus raising our mutual profiles and amplifying our impact collectively. Whilst it is often helpful to get a mainstream celebrity to speak at an event, try to put some of your own on the stage as well, so that they will become known in their own right. Present them as experts, they often are. This is what the Property Council of Australia and APOC do. The Can Do Better Net website, where I write and edit, promotes population activists and their activities where the mainstream press ignores them, preferring paid spokespeople from big business who tout growth. Our articles get thousands and tens of thousands of reads over time. One recent article got 12,000 reads in 3 weeks. We are actually a website for reform in democracy, environment, population, land use planning and energy policy, which is quite a good way to promote the cause over a wide area. I didn't think I'd get time to say this, but I think it's very important for us all to use direct and reliable sources of information, and Hansard is a superb direct source for politics and a great thing to report from, write articles based on, and then there's the CSIRO, Australian Resources Atlas Project, the State of the Environment Report Australia 2001, which incidentally gives population protections for 100,000 net migration per annum, and sees these as very pessimistic for the environment, and we're at double that at the moment. ABS projections are a very necessary source of important information and a part of public education, but they rely on accurate information, and if there are suddenly new policies that skew immigration, they can't predict those. YouTube is another valuable direct source of information, and that's where we can put films and republish each other. Russia Today gives the other side of the NATO line on foreign wars and so on. Press TV, Global Research, VoltaireNet, Land Destroyer, the Syrian Arab News Agency, Sana.sy, gives you another perspective on NATO. There's lots to see out there. We don't have to rely on the mainstream media. Thank you.